Hey everyone, this is Andrea, and today we're going to be starting step 3 of the Carbon tutorial. So we've already finished steps 1 and 2, which is installing Carbon, and step 2 was building out both the repo pages and the landing pages, and adding a lot of styling. So adding a lot of content, images, things of that nature. But I'm really excited to be starting step 3 today because we'll actually be fetching and rendering from the GitHub GraphQL API, which I've never done before, so I think that'll be a lot of fun. This is what our final product should look like today. So it's actually quite similar to step 2. Except in step 2, we hard-coded all of this data and information. So now we'll be programmatically rendering it from the GitHub API. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Make sure to, I've already done this, but make sure to fetch upstream and check out the branch, which is React step 3. So I'm going to go ahead and install some dependencies, and then we're going to start the app. Got some windows open. Okay. Next. So it looks like we'll be installing Apollo Boost and GraphQL and React Apollo. Sorry, that's taking a little while. There we go. Okay, so everything's kind of running as expected. Perfect. So I'm going to stop this and add these dependencies. Let's look at our next step. Okay, so I was reading about this before. So I'm going to go through the steps of creating an access token. They do have a guide or the GitHub link here for creating an access token. So if you haven't done so before, feel free to look at that just to learn a little bit more about it. But essentially, we're going to be going into our GitHub profile, clicking settings, going down into developer settings, and then clicking personal access token. So I'm going to delete this one and create a new one. So we're going to generate a new token. Okay. And we're going to add a name to it, the Carbon tutorial. In terms of the scope, we don't have to click anything here, so we're just going to click Generate Token. Awesome. And let's see what it says in terms of files. So since we don't want to commit this file to Git, we can put in a .env, which is your gitignore list. Okay. So I am going to create a .env.local file. And we need to make sure that this is in our root directory of the project. And from here, we're going to copy and paste our variable name, and this is where we are going to add our access token. So I'm going to copy this. Perfect. Let's see. Okay. I'm going to close this. Also, please make sure that there is a dot before your E and V. I've done that in the past where I haven't, and it's taken me forever to debug because I've been getting errors and for some reason didn't just add the dot before my file. Basically just a syntax error. Okay, go ahead and start your app with Yarn Start. And add these to, so connecting to Apollo. The React Apollo library gives us the component that we need to put at the base of our application. Add these two imports into your source.index file. So while that's going, awesome. Okay, so I'm going to go open up my source. Oh, I'm already in it. So we will be adding those imports here. Perfect. Next, make our client by providing URI to the GitHub for the GitHub GraphQL API. Okay. So we will be adding basically access to our GitHub token. Perfect. Now we can wrap our application with the Apollo provider. At the same time, we'll pass in the client we just made as a prop to the Apollo provider component. So now we've passed the client as a prop and we've wrapped our app in the Apollo provider. Next, fetch data. Add the following imports to the top of the repo page. Okay, so we'll be adding GQL and query to our repo. Next, we'll assemble our GraphQL query to fetch only the data we need from the GraphQL API. We'll do this using the GQL helper we just imported. Okay, the GQL helper lets you write GraphQL queries using interpolated strings, otherwise known as backticks, in JavaScript. Perfect. Okay, so we'll be adding this into our repo page. So, doing that. Next, helpers. Below that, we should have our table headers set in a previous step that are good to go. Let's also keep our example rows below that. Our last column in the data table will be a comma-separated list of repository and homepage links. So let's create a component called link list. Import link at the top of the repo page. Let's do this actually up here. Then use link in this component has two props, URL and homepage URL, and returns an unordered list. If the repository does not have a homepage URL, only render the repository link. Okay, so we're going to be adding this also to our repo page. Cool. As a final helper, let's create a function that transforms row data to our expected header keys. Notice how we're using new link list component to generate the value of the links in each row. Cool, so we'll be adding this function to kind of manipulate our data to reflect expected header keys. So let's add this kind of right below. Next, query component. At this point, we should run our query and console.log the results to verify that the request is working. We'll need to render the repo table in queries return statement once the request is no longer loading and when there are no errors. To do so, replace the repo table line with the following query. Okay, so it looks like we'll be replacing this query. We'll be replacing this repo table with that query. So it looks like it's still returning it here. Okay, so the page will look the same as we're still rendering our static example rows. Let's see. Oh, cool. I think it said something, but if you view your browser's console, you should see the response from GitHub. Object. That's awesome. Perfect. Okay. Hopefully y'all can see this in your console. Okay. Populate data table. Now that we have that data, let's populate the data table. Replace console.log organization with the following that destructures the organization object. So let's copy this destructuring and replace our current console.log Then, towards the top of the repo page, delete the rows array because we no longer need the example rows. This is true. Where are they? Oh. Okay. Next, render repository description. The data table component and its pieces use a common React pattern called render props. This is a really powerful way for libraries to give developers control of rendering and manipulating their data. Okay, instead of kind of reading this word by word, let's kind of jump down here. So we need to modify one aspect of the data table because if you expand a row, it says row description. We want to update that with the repository description coming from the GitHub API. So we want to start dynamically rendering this information. This is an example of where we need a simple lookup function to find the data we care about. Data does not directly correspond to a column. To do so in repotable.js, add this lookup function as the first lines inside the repo table. This should go immediately before the components return. Okay, so we're going to be now navigating to our repo table. Oops. And we'll be adding this immediately before the return, I believe. Finally, in repo table, we'll replace row description with, looks like we're now grabbing the row ID. Add loading. At this point, the first time that you visit the repository pages, we're querying the GitHub API and rendering the response through the data table component. We could stop here, but there's more to be done. Let's replace the loading string with the data skeleton component, data table skeleton component. That's a super cool name. To do so, back to RepoPage.js, add the data table skeleton import by modifying the existing Carbon components React import. So let's go back to our repo page. Perfect. Then replace if loading return loading with the following data table skeleton component. Cool. We need to tell the loading skeleton how many rows to render, so let's use 10 skeleton rows to prepare for the next enhancement. So it looks like that's what was added here, the 10 row count. Add pagination. Instead of rendering every repository, let's add pagination to the data table to only render 10 at a time. Okay, we'll be using React hooks to manage our state. Hooks are a relatively new React API that allows us to author the React component's stateful logic in a function component rather than a class component. Import React's use state by modifying the React import. I only kind of recently learned about React hooks, and it is so cool and so amazing. So I definitely recommend y'all to look into it a little bit more. It also gets rid of like binding and the confusion with this. So yes, definitely a new, amazing, powerful React API. Okay, moving on. Then initialize new state variables that we'll use for pagination as the first lines inside the repo page component above return. So looks like now we're setting some state variables. This initializes the total number of rows in the index of the first row to 0 and the page size to 10. Next, we need to use a function that updates the total items state, set total items, after we destructure our organization repositories. Your block that transforms the row data should look like. Okay, so if we go down here, perfect. Then we need to update our repo table rows prop to only render the subset of rows for the current page. Update repo table headers to, so now it looks like we're kind of limiting so that it only renders a subset. I believe it's a repo table. Oops. Okay. Next, we only pass the rows that we want our table to display. We can do this by slicing the array of our rows depending on the first item in the page. So it looks like that's what we did here. Finally, let's add the pagination to update our state variables and cause the data table to render new rows. Import pagination by updating the Carbon React import. So we're now adding the pagination component. Perfect. Immediately after the repo table closing tag, add the pagination. Let's see where this closes. There we go. Okay. Note the pagination component isn't inherently connected in any way to the data table. We need to tell it what we want to do when a change occurs using the onChange prop. This includes both page size changes and displaying different rows. Like the other Carbon React components, pagination component examples can be found in Storybook by browsing the story and knobs. Cool. That does it. Your data table should fetch GitHub data on first render. Let's see. Oh no. Let's see what happened with link. Oh. I'm going to move this, import that. Let's see what it does now. There it is. How cool. That's so awesome. Okay. So just to quickly recap, what we've done now is we fetched all of this data from the GraphQL API, which is basically what we had kind of hard-coded before in step 2. Doesn't seem like much changed other than that, but that was really, really fun to play around with. And yeah, looks like our next step is just submitting a pull request. So let's follow through with that step. Sorry, I don't know what's going on with my voice. Okay. Let's open up our terminal again. This is so awesome. And then we'll just do a git commit and a push. And then we'll be pushing to origin. And then we'll be creating a pull request. Let's see, compare across forks. So our base is Carbon Design, and then our base, please make sure that it's React Step 2. Let's see. Oh, sorry. React Step 3. That's totally my fault. And here is my repo. Perfect. So this is what it should look like. Our base being Carbon Design System, our head being your repo, the base being React Step 3, and your branch, React Step 3. Okay, so as I kind of wrap up this step number 3 in the Carbon tutorial series, I wanted to end on some final just like thoughts. One, I thought it was really, really fun working with the GraphQL API. As I mentioned at the beginning of the video, I had never worked with their API, and yeah, it was just like really fun to get a little bit familiar with it. And then 2, the last thing is I did see quite a few questions just regarding fetching and personal access tokens. So I just wanted to remind everyone of the Carbon tutorial Slack channel. It's incredibly active. There are so many amazing questions there being answered actively by the Carbon team. And it's just another great resource for a question that you might have, just even searching in the Carbon tutorial, because I'm sure someone's kind of already asked it, and if not, asking them and they will actively reply and help you work through your issue. So once again, this is what our final product should look like after step 3, fetching and rendering data from the GitHub GraphQL API. We will be stepping into part 4 of the series next, so creating components. Definitely looking forward to that. But yeah, other than these kind of last thoughts, it was a really straightforward tutorial and a lot of fun to work through. Thanks again, and see you soon.